Understanding the sun in the 11th house begins, or should begin, with a really brief but very important review of what the 11th house is and what the sun is. So here you can see a depiction of physically what the 11th house is. It's the slice of sky that's above your head, but slightly to the east. This physical fact is the basis for all of the things that the 11th house symbolizes. The upper part of the sky symbolizes society, and the eastern part of the sky symbolizes the self. So the 11th house symbolizes the way we benefit from what society has to offer. So what does society have to offer? Basically, there's three categories of benefits. There's social benefits, cultural benefits, and economic opportunities. So as for social benefits, now you probably understand why the 11th house is the house of friends. What kind of friends are those? Those are just the people that are in your town, the people that are at your school, the people that you do things with. They're not your best friends for life or any of that. They're just people that you party with, people that you play with. And this is also why the 11th house describes what kind of a social network you have, how many contacts you have, and who you could call if you want to party, or if you want to get some kind of an advantage or an opportunity. Do you know somebody? That's described by the 11th house. As for cultural benefits, this is why the 11th is the house of arts. How do we benefit from society culturally? Well, that's all the dance and music and theater and cinema and everything. And so this is why it's an extremely important house for entertainment and entertainers. This is why it represents all the talent that's involved in producing art, and also what most people don't often think about is the talent that is required to even experience or appreciate art. As for the economic opportunities that society provides us with, it provides you with a market. So this is why the 11th is the house of income and profit and money and wealth and things that you can party with, things that you can enjoy, things that are beautiful and artistic. Wealth, money, profit, income. What is wealth really? Wealth is a pleasurable thing. And so the bottom line of the 11th house, of all this stuff of friends, parties, arts, talent, taste, income, money, it's all about this is how you enjoy life. What is the sun going to symbolize when it's here in this environment of the 11th house? To know that, just take 2 minutes and review what the sun is all about. The sun is the brightest planet, and thus it symbolizes the soul, because the soul is the source of our consciousness or awareness, and light is symbolic of awareness. Light enables awareness, right? So the sun represents light, and hence it has to do with vision and visibility. This is why the sun represents how visible or public you are. And that's why the sun is a male planet. Something which makes itself visible is male. The male organ is visible. The male nature is extroversive, demonstrative, loud. The sun represents maleness, and it represents the extroverse, the external world, the public, society, etc. So the sun represents how visible you are, and it also represents how much vision you have. So a person who has a vision knows where the goal is and directs people how to get to it, and orders themselves and gets to their goal. They have a sense of leadership, command. So the sun represents command, authorities, people who set the direction, people who set the standard and the path, the kings, the rulers, the leaders, the bosses, the dads. It's particularly a male kind of authority, hence dad. Now, as we said, the sun represents the soul, and the soul is awareness, but the awareness is the core around which we build identity. We build our identity based on what we're aware of. I'm aware of being a human, so that influences my identity. I'm aware of living in Japan. The identity is built based on what you're aware of. So the sun also represents identity, and that whole concept of the central thing around which other things are built. So it represents the self, and it represents the core, or the central figure. And also the awareness within a life form is the animator of the life form. And so the sun represents animus, or life force. And that's why it has to do with health. Now, we have completed successfully our review of the sun and the 11th house. And it is high time for us to, as they say on YouTube, jump right into it. And, talk about the sun and the 11th house. Because God knows nobody on YouTube wants to wait for anything. But if you don't wait a little bit, then you might jump into things unprepared. So I hope you didn't mind waiting through that review. Now, sun in the 11th house, how do you figure out what it means? You put them side by side and you think about where they are on the same page, because that can be where they connect. So, for example, when we talked about the sun, we said it was a visible planet. It's highly visible, so it's highly public. And public means the society and everything. And when we talked about the 11th house, we mentioned it was high up in the sky, so it has to do with society and the benefits we get from society. So the 11th house is a social place, and the sun is a outward or visible planet. So those two concepts fit together in a complementary way. So that's one thing that we would want to explore or think about when we're trying to get a feeling or an intuition for what the sun symbolizes when it's in the 11th house. Another thing is that the sun is very commandy. It's leadershipy. It's the authority on anything. And the 11th house has something that fits with that, because the 11th house is so talented. So those two things kind of fit together also in an interesting way, and that's a subtext of another thing that we should think about and try to get an intuition for when trying to get the pulse of what the sun symbolizes in the 11th house. And there's one other thing which is interesting about the sun. The sun represents the self, but the 11th house, it represents friends. So you might think that this is a way that the sun and the 11th house fit together in a non-complementary way. Sun is self and 11th house is friends. But actually remember that the type of friend in the 11th house isn't the friend for whom we sacrifice. Or it's not the type of friend that sacrifices for us. It's the type of friend that just benefits from us, and it's the type of friend that we benefit from. So it's really not incompatible that the sun is self-oriented and that the 11th house is friends-oriented. So take that off the list. That's not something that we have to think about. If it was, then we would have to have a negative intuition about the sun in the 11th house on that topic of self-interfering with friends. But because the type of friend in the 11th house is actually compatible with selfishness, then therefore this isn't an issue. So now what you want to do is kind of visualize or imagine how these things fit together and what it means. So for example, the sun being public and the 11th house being social, it means that these people are very good with being social. So what does that mean? Think about it, intuit it, if you get a feeling for it. We have it with the sun in the 11th house. So the people with the sun in the 11th house, they like to enjoy their friends. They like to enjoy wealth. They like to enjoy society. They like to show themselves. They like to be out there. And they like to even be enjoyable. They like to be enjoyed by others. So they're enjoyers. The sun in the 11th house is an enjoyer. They like the world, and they like to interact with the world, and they like to enjoy it, and they like to be enjoyed by it. And hence, they like enjoyable stuff, and they're good with enjoyable stuff. So like, they're probably good looking. They're probably attractive in some other way as well, like they're qualified or talented or artistic. And quite likely, they have a lot of enjoyable stuff. And so we can say they're wealthier, they have money. You see, this is how you get an intuition about what the sun in the 11th house signifies and how you fructify that intuition into some concrete imagery that you can then take. This concrete imagery is still abstract because it's just the sun in the 11th house. Maybe you watching this video have the sun in the 11th house, but I don't know what sign it's in. I don't know what other planets it's with. I don't know what lord it is. I don't know what aspects it's getting. But I do know about the sun in the 11th house, and what I can tell you in this video is about the sun in the 11th house. And you can take that imagery, and then you have to get an intuition about how that imagery sits with the rest of the stuff that's affecting your sun in the 11th house. And I'll show you how to do that in 4 charts in this video, so you get a hang of how it works. But the other thing about sun in the 11th house is we said that the sun was the authority, and that the 11th house is a very talented person. So it's not exactly a match, but the 11th house, in other words, produces a person who is very qualified to be a leader. And the sun indicates a person who is very eager to be a leader. The sun is eager to be a leader, and the 11th house is very capable of being the best at things. So you can see how they're on the same page. And the implication of it, therefore, or the interpretation of the sun in the 11th house is the people are talented. They're sophisticated. They're artistic. They're leaders in that field of enjoyment. They're leaders in the field of creativity and art, etc. So like I promised, we will now look at 4 charts that have the sun in the 11th house to see how this concept of the sun in the 11th house actually works in an actual person. We're going to look at Jim Morrison, Marilyn Monroe, Ernest Hemingway, and Donald Trump. Now, I didn't cherry pick these people. These are just, I have a small database of people with known birth times, and these are the people that have the sun in the 11th house in my small database. Talented, sophisticated, artistic, they really like to enjoy. Donald Trump, he's like the guy that wants all the money in the world. He wants wealth. Ernest Hemingway, a very talented writer. Marilyn Monroe, super sex symbol. Jim Morrison, super sex symbol, an artist. You might be thinking, how come I'm not like Jim Morrison or Marilyn Monroe? That's from the rest of the chart. So now let's look in detail. Jim Morrison's sun in the 11th house in Sagittarius, the most philosophical of all the zodiac signs. If you're a Jim Morrison fan, then you probably recognize that phrase. Yeah, there it is. That's what he's talking about, sun in Sagittarius, and it's in his 11th house. So he's got this nature of being kind of philosophical or something. He's a philosophical artist, this psychedelic type of thing. But that's how maybe he thinks about himself, but most of this Jim Morrison is just sex appeal. So what is really going on with his chart? Well, his sun, if it's in Sagittarius in the 11th house, that means Leo is the 7th house. So his sun in Sagittarius, 11th house, is the 7th lord. The 7th lord in the 11th house is very sexy, because the 7th house has to do with sex and intercourse, and the 11th house is pleasure. So the sun in the 7th house makes you capable and kind of outstanding and enjoying, and it makes you have a good hunger for enjoying, not shy about enjoying, etc. And then as the 7th lord in the 11th house, that really makes it quite a sexual flavor to this. And now the 11th house Sagittarius belongs to Jupiter. Sagittarius belongs to Jupiter. So where's Jupiter in this chart? Oh my, Jupiter is in the 7th house. So his 7th lord is in the 11th, and his 11th lord is in the 7th. So he has an exchange or circuit, parivartana, between 11 and 7. There's your sex symbol. Taking our eye off the sun just to look briefly on the rest of the chart for other things like that support stuff about the sun in the 11th house. That's what you want to do. If a person has a sun in the 11th house, but nothing else in the chart is artistic or hedonistic or money-oriented, then none of this potential of the sun in the 11th house got any help. So you would be sort of amiss to expect that sun in the 11th interpretations would be a very accurate, direct description of the person. But in Morrison's case, his moon is exalted in the 4th house. So that's very supportive of what the sun in the 11th house represents. The moon in the exalted in the 4th house is very artistic and also very sexy. And on top of that, look at his 5th house for creativity. Also, always look at the 5th and 3rd house for creativity. His 5th house has the 3rd lord in it. That's very important for creativity. And it also has the 1st lord in it. So that 3rd lord Mars is also the 10th. So that means the 1st lord Saturn and the 10th lord Mars join in the 5th house. So the 1st lord self and 10th lord career joining in the house of creativity. And when the 1st and 10th lords join, that's called Raja Yoga. So that's very supportive of anything having to do with the sun, to have a Raja Yoga. So here you see Jim Morrison in the full picture. A really creative artist that's somewhat psychedelic, somewhat philosophical, but mostly just very, very sexy. Now let's have a look at Marilyn Monroe, the Great. So again, sun is in the 11th house, just like Morrison. But in her case, it's in Gemini. So that means she has the 1st lord in the 11th house. The sun in the 11th house is the 1st lord. The 1st lord is your physical self, your body. So the sun in the 11th house had all this potential for beauty, etc. Well, if it's the 1st lord, then that's what it's really going to take advantage of. That's really going to be highlighted. And sure enough, Marilyn Monroe is physically beautiful. On top of that, it's with Mercury. Mercury is extremely beautiful. It's very refined and well-defined. So there's another source of beauty. And on top of that, it's in Gemini. Gemini is very refined. Gemini is very delicate and detailed and beautiful. So the sun in the 11th house for anybody has the potential to indicate beauty. But if it's in the 11th house, Gemini is the 1st lord with the 11th lord, Mercury, then it's very, very, very beautiful. On top of that, looking elsewhere to see if there's anything that supports this, the moon is right across from her ascendant. So the moon, the most beautiful planet, is aspecting the ascendant, the point that defines the 1st house, and therefore most directly influences how you look. So that's super supportive. There's another source of beauty. And then Jupiter is also kicking its aspect into here too, as well as aspecting the sun and Mercury in the 11th house. Jupiter is the 8th lord. The 8th lord is sex, reproduction, sexiness, sex drive. Jupiter is the planet of reproduction and children. So having the 1st lord in the 11th house with the 11th lord in Gemini with Mercury while aspected by Jupiter, the 8th lord, that is very beautiful in a sexy way. And on top of that, she's got Mars in the 8th house in Pisces. This is extremely sexy. And that Mars is, by its square aspect, aspecting those 2 planets in the 11th house as well. So this is Marilyn Monroe to a T. And this is why somebody else with the sun in the 11th house isn't Marilyn Monroe. So now Ernest Hemingway, another one with the sun in the 11th house, who's a very different person. Sure, they have stuff in common, but he's quite different from Morrison or Marilyn. So, first thing you notice about his sun in the 11th house is that it's right next to Venus. So maybe he's beautiful, or maybe he's an artist. And if it's in Cancer, that means that Leo is the 12th house. So it's not really supporting the concept of him being beautiful. Rather, it's supporting the concept of him being quiet, being secluded. Sun in Cancer supports the idea of being quiet or secluded. not dominant, not seen. Sun is the 12th lord in the 11th house, also secluded. Yet Sun in the 11th house is dominant and expressive. So we're seeing a more complicated picture. It's a person that's outgoing, but yet secluded. Sometimes this happens when you read a chart. It's very confusing for a while. Now, if we look further, I would probably just look next at the 11th lord. Where did it go? If I'm interested in figuring out what the sun in the 11th house is all about, I would look at the 11th lord. So look where it went. It went to the 5th house. And it went to 10 degrees of the 5th house, which means it's very influential because the ascendant is 8. So that means that the 11th house is very, very blessed because its own lord is aspecting it very, very strongly from a place, the 5th house, that's very compatible with the 11th house themes, which is creativity. So his 11th house is really enhanced by creative talent. So what's this showing us now is here's an artist. That's what this Venus is all about. Sure, the guy's good looking, but mostly he's artist. A very talented artist, and he probably does his art in a studio somewhere. Or he probably is not a performing artist because the sun is in Cancer as the 12th lord. This is how you narrow down the possibilities of an interpretation. Then I would next always just, if I run out of options, I would just look at the 1st house. What is it? It's Virgo. Virgo is pretty wordy. Virgo is very good with words. And sure enough, what planet is in Virgo is his 3rd lord. So the 3rd lord has the potential to give skill in writing. And if it's in Virgo, then that's what it does. It gives the potential to use words, especially writing. And if it's in the 1st house, then it's quite an important part of the person's chart. And remember what I said about the 3rd and the 5th houses? You want to get them together somehow if you really want to know that a person is artistically talented. Well, his 3rd lord is Mars, and it's exactly square to Saturn. In exactly the right position, where Saturn is 90 degrees from Mars, and Mars is 270 degrees from Saturn. So they have a perfect mutual aspect on each other, the 5th and the 7th lord. Now we can be totally sure. This is not a model. I'm sure he's a good-looking person. He's an artist who works in seclusion with his hands. And if you have to make a guess whether he's a painter or a writer, you would go. It could go either way. But you would probably define him as a writer because of the Virgo ascendant. And then you'd be right on the money. Finally, we have this fellow, Donald Trump, who kind of maybe seems different than the other ones. He's not a sexy guy like Jim Morrison. He's not appealing, really. I guess he is appealing in some way. Very, very appealing. He has a huge following, doesn't he? But he's not like sexually appealing or artistically appealing, so it doesn't seem to fit with Marilyn Monroe types or Jim Morrison types. I guess he kind of is like an Ernest Hemingway in being this bold, masculine type of person, but he's very unartistic. So what is the sun in the 11th house with Trump? Well, remember, it's giving you you're an enjoyer. Sun in the 11th house means enjoyer. That's what all these people have in common. And Trump is the epitome of an enjoyer. He's like over-the-top hedonist. So if you look at his chart, it's kind of shockingly similar to Monroe's in a sense. He's got the same ascendant, Leo. So his sun in the 11th house is in Gemini as the 1st lord. So what? Does that mean he should be as beautiful as Marilyn Monroe? Well, no. Is it the same as Marilyn Monroe's? Use your head. Marilyn Monroe has all kinds of things going on in her chart to make a person beautiful. Trump has this one thing. So maybe he has fancy hair or something. It's this one thing that it's the first lord in Gemini in the 11th house, but it's with Rahu. Is Rahu a good-looking planet? No. And where are his good-looking planets? They're tucked away in the 12th or the 3rd. So it's not really that he's a beautiful person. Rather, his sun is with Rahu, very close to Rahu. It's actually in an eclipse, so it's very, very, very Rahuized sun. What is Rahu? Rahu is avariciousness. Rahu is hunger. And is there something about the sun in the 11th house that can get on the same page with avariciousness and hunger? Yes. The sun in the 11th house is an enjoyer. It loves to enjoy. It's a masculine force in the house of pleasures. So it loves it. It wants to enjoy that house. And now Trump has it with Rahu. So he's total avaricious. Very, very hungry for money. Very, very hungry for power. Very, very hungry for items of wealth and profit and so forth. If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcarrot.com/R2. Thank you so much.